Good, good. I shave my head just when I know I'm going to interview you.
Oh, is there?
I know you like it. You like it short. How are you, Colonel?
Oh, I'm surviving.
I'm glad. I'm glad. Um, well, today, we were planning to talk about one thing when we organized this interview, and then something happened in the last 2 hours. So it just keeps changing. Let's kind of give a recap for the audience. I'll let you fill the gaps as well. So essentially, Trump and Zelensky were, set to meet. Trump had a call with Putin. And there's been reports that Putin made an offer to Trump. Now, these are reports. I think it was by the Washington Post, according to two sources. And that offer included Ukraine giving up the Donbas, which is mainly Donetsk, 25% of Donetsk that Ukraine still controls. And Russia either freezes the lines in Zaporizhia and Kherson, the other two oblasts, or gives up some territory. Other reports that say Russia is willing to give up some territory. We don't know how much. So that was allegedly the offer that was made by Putin to Trump. Then Trump went to Zelensky. And apparently there was a shouting match. I'm not sure how accurate there it is. It's according to other sources, European sources. And essentially Trump was trying to get Zelensky to accept the deal and allegedly said the words, I'm sick of seeing the front line. Zelensky's position is he prefers a ceasefire and freezing the current front line, which works in Ukraine's advantage considering that Russia is advancing. And then today, there was a call between Rubio and Lavrov, Foreign Minister Lavrov. And again, allegedly the call did not go too well. Lavrov again referenced the root causes that Putin always talks about, which is a demilitarization of Ukraine, no NATO, recognition of Donbas, but essentially there was no middle ground. And about an hour or two ago, apparently the White House said the meeting between Putin and Trump has been canceled, and the meeting between Lavrov and Rubio. Your thoughts?
Well, I think it's probably a good thing that the meeting is not going to be held. If you're going to negotiate over something, both sides have to agree to a set of facts, and that has never happened. The West has insisted on its own set of facts, which are rooted in deep-seated hostility to Russia, and Russia has a different set of facts and is the injured party in Moscow's view, and whose legitimate national security interests have been rejected. So under the circumstances, unless you're willing to visit the core issues, unless you're willing to admit that this war did not begin simply because Vladimir Putin woke up in the middle of the night and decided, oh, I think I'll invade Ukraine, and you go to the core issues, what brought about this war and why Russia wants Ukraine to be neutral, which it sees as absolutely vital to its national security, and I don't think you're going to get very far. And so it's probably better, at least for the moment, that no such meeting occur. There's always a danger if you go into a meeting where you don't agree on the very basic facts of the event, then you could actually make matters worse and end up leaving the meeting with a higher probability of confrontation than you did when you entered. So I'm not personally disappointed, but I think we have to understand that you have two different views, two different interpretations. I think ours is very wrong. I think the West is very wrong. And I think privately, President Trump actually knows that. But he's not a free agent. He has to deal with his donors who own him. He has to deal with the recalcitrant Congress that wants war. He has to deal with a whole range of issues here at home. And I think he decided under the circumstances, it's better I not meet. So the two irreconcilable sets of views remain unchanged for the moment. And I think it will be decided on the battlefield.
What do you think of Russia's alleged offer of Ukraine pulling out of the Donbas and Russia giving up some territory in Kherson and Zaporizhia? Do you think it's a fair offer? Do you think Ukraine would do you think this is an actual offer that Russia would have made?
I don't know. We're victims of secondhand information. I'm surprised that the Russians offered anything. If you look at the map, I think it would be unwise for them to make the offer that they did. But the fact that if it was in fact offered and the Ukrainians said no, suggests to Moscow that there is no room for negotiation and that the only outcome is the one that is decided on the battlefield. So I think we will see some substantial change in the advancing of Russian forces to the west. I think they'll roll up to the river now. I think that Odessa and Kharkov are both back on the menu where they were to begin with. And we'll see what happens when the inevitable occurs, and that is that the Ukrainians can do nothing to stop the Russians. They're effectively in that position now. But the Russians have always been reticent about moving too far west. First, they didn't want to upset us. They didn't want a war with us under any circumstances. And they wanted to avoid a war with NATO, but by avoiding a war with us, de facto, you don't get a war with NATO. The other thing is that the Russians don't understand why U.S.-Russian relations are not at the top of President Trump's agenda. There are many, many good reasons from the Russian standpoint for us in the United States to cooperate economically, commercially, politically, diplomatically with Russia. And indeed, I think President Trump feels the same way. But he's constrained. Again, so you've got to go back. Who's contributed to his campaign? Who he surrounds himself with? Who are the power brokers in Washington that fund senatorial and congressional campaigns? Those people are largely the same, not entirely, but largely the same as the ones that are driving us to war in the Middle East. So why would they suddenly say, all right, that's fine. Let's come to an understanding with the Russians and get past this? I think President Trump would like to do that, but I don't see any evidence for the others.
Is there any chance or any circumstances where Russia would accept not to have the entire Donbas under their control?
I can't imagine any. Historically, it's Russian. Again, this is the other thing that we absolutely refuse to acknowledge or discuss. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's no longer with us, I didn't always agree with everything he said, but he was a brilliant man, and I studied all of his works when I was in graduate school. And he went to President Clinton in the 1990s, early on, and he said, look, we've got a problem in Eastern Europe. It's called Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine is Russified, has been Russified for a very, very long time. We've got to come to terms with reality that Ukraine probably should be separated into a Russian portion and a genuinely Ukrainian portion. The sooner we do that, the better. I know that John Mearsheimer keeps announcing to everybody that he was the first person to suggest there was a problem, but that's not true. And Brzezinski mentioned that directly to President Clinton. President Clinton considered it again when we brought Poland into NATO, because in the background, the warning was, well, I'm a Pole. I'm happy to see this happen. That was Brzezinski. But on the other hand, we're courting potential disaster because of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So the bottom line is we're dealing with issues that are much larger than, do we have a ceasefire? Do we trade some territory? I wish it were that easy. And I think that's been President Putin's message to President Trump from the beginning. Remember, it was President Trump who said, I could end this in 24 hours. He had no idea how deep the historical, cultural roots were, had no idea of the complexity of the problems that he was dealing with. I think he does. I mean, if you listen to him, he spoke and he said, I told Zelensky that Putin would destroy him. Well, that's probably true. Either make this deal or you're going to be destroyed. Well, that doesn't sound like Trump, who said Ukraine can still win, does it? Of course not.
What about the flip-flopping on the Tomahawk missiles? So in essentially, he hinted that they will supply Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. Then after the call with Putin, in the meeting with Zelensky, it's off the table. Two reasons that were reported. One is Putin convinced him to not do so. And the other argument, and it's a fair argument as well, is that stockpiles are running out in the U.S.
I think that both arguments are valid, but the second one is very definitely important. And it's obvious from President Trump's remarks within the last 48 to 72 hours that he is well aware of just how low the numbers of missiles are in our inventory. If you're sitting in the Department of Defense, what you do is that you look at the numbers of missiles, all types of missiles, standard everything. Then you look at the number of launchers and how many cells are in each launcher. Then you simply multiply, you do the mathematics, and you know that you have to have as a minimum 3 per cell in every launcher. So if you have 6 cells, that means that you've got 18 missiles for that launcher. Now that's minimum. Ideally, they like to have 5 per each cell. Why? Because it's a war of attrition. How many missiles can you fire? How many can they fire back at you, and so forth? We are a maritime and naval power. This is very important. People don't get this. We are not a land power in Europe or anywhere in the Eastern Hemisphere. Russia is a continental power. It's a land power. They're not competing with us at sea with a large surface fleet. They don't need it. They maintain a substantial and capable submarine fleet as a means of protection and defense, but that's it. Their Air Force is modest compared to what we employ, but they're not in the business of projecting their military power into the Caribbean, into the Gulf of Mexico, or now the Gulf of America. They're not projecting power into Canada. We're the ones projecting power into the Eastern Hemisphere. So my point is, we have to have a lot more on hand in our magazines that are already deployed before we fight. And he got the message. We can't.
What are the stockpiles like now? How many per launcher would you say? The preference is 5. But if you had to take a wild guess,
I can't do that. That's too close to the reality. And my point is simply this: we have many, many types of missiles, many munitions. All of these are accounted for. You look at your sustainability. How long can you fight with what you have? And right now, we're on the ragged edge of not lasting very long. This came up when we were engaged with Iran. You saw what happened in Israel. Israel ran out, effectively, of its anti-missiles, its air and missile defense, and it was also running low in strike missiles. We shot a lot of our air and missile defense to protect them. Now, have we recovered? Yes, we've recovered somewhat. But to really recover, you need years. Remember, we are not running manufacturing assembly lines for weapons 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The Russians are. They are running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We can't surge that quickly. And here's the last point that needs to be borne in mind. Russia is allied with China. China has the largest manufacturing base in the world. The Chinese will run off as many missiles, rockets, bombs, whatever you want to call them, as required to support Russia. So we're in kind of a bad position strategically. All of the behavior and comments and statements that President Trump has made were never very carefully thought through. I think probably General Kane, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he's a senior military advisor to the president, has gotten his attention and made this clear. So that's absolutely true. The first part, did Putin convince him of anything? If anything, I think President Putin said, this is another step in escalation. Do you really want to escalate the war with Russia? Because you're going to
threaten with something, maybe.
What?
Could he make a threat? If you do this, we will do that, and then Trump was caught off guard. Maybe not worth the gamble.
Putin is not like Trump. He doesn't threaten and bully people. He simply says, if you do this, if you provide X number of Tomahawk missiles, and remember, you've got air-launched, sea-launched, and then you have ground-launched. Most of our Tomahawks are air and sea-launched. Only a small number are available for the U.S. Army to be launched from trucks. Now, those trucks with those missiles, perhaps 20, perhaps 30, perhaps 40, we don't know, could be available to the Ukrainians. However, American soldiers or contractors who are former American soldiers probably would have to operate those systems. That is a dramatic increase in the escalatory approach to war. That means that Americans and American systems are actively employing these against Russia, not inside Ukraine. We're talking about targets inside Russia. And somebody said, well, we'll just shoot these at refineries, or we'll shoot these at nuclear power plants, God forbid. That would be a disaster, because, you know, the Russians have gone to great lengths to insulate the one in Zaporizhzhia, which they control, from the war. But Ukraine has, I think, 2 or 3 more nuclear power stations. The point is, they could also accidentally end up in a civilian area. In other words, an area where the population lives, and kill large numbers of Russians. I don't think it takes much imagination to figure out that with 1,000+ mile range, that kind of damage is not going to change the outcome of the war. It's not going to make any difference to whether or not Ukraine survives or doesn't. But it could escalate the tensions to the point where the Russians decide to abandon any restraint and move forward. And I think President Trump recognized that, and he says, I don't want a war with Russia. And he doesn't.
So that was my next question: is what could it change things on the ground? Because Ukraine does have the Flamingo missiles, less capable, but they can strike deep into Russia. How much better are the Tomahawk missiles compared to the Flamingo missiles?
You know, I don't know as much about the Flamingo missile. I don't know. Is it a hypersonic missile? If it's not, it doesn't make much difference. See, the Tomahawk is not hypersonic. Tomahawks were shot down by Syrian air defenses when Trump was in office. He launched Tomahawks into the desert in Syria under false pretenses. These were false flags created by MI6, accusing the Assad regime of gassing its own people. Nonsense like that was not true. But unfortunately, President Trump reacted emotionally to pictures of children that were allegedly victims of this. He launched these missiles. The Syrians shot several of them down. In 1999, the Serb air defenses shot many of our Tomahawk missiles down. We don't admit to it, but they did. So these are not hypersonic. You could shoot.
Neither is the Flamingo, by the way.
Okay, well, if that's the case for the Flamingo, then it doesn't make much difference. However, depending on who's launching the Flamingo missiles, Germans, Frenchmen, British, I don't know who they are, and from where they launched it and whatever they hit, they could escalate tensions with Russia. And the Russians have been very clear. They have the capacity to hit targets all up and down the edge of NATO. Poland, Romania, Lithuania, all of these countries that have NATO bases and any NATO troops in them would be at risk. They're not going to tolerate attacks by the British, the French, and the Germans under the guise that these are coming from Ukraine, because they know they're not Ukrainian manufactured. They're not Ukrainian inventions.
All right. So what now then? So we've got this meeting canceled. Everyone's looking forward to it. The war continues. Things are not looking on the ground. People continue dying on a daily basis. Both parties are on two separate pages. Zelensky wants to freeze the battlefront, freeze the current lines, stop the fighting, immediate ceasefire. Putin prefers to either continue or gain Donbas, at least gain the Donbas. How would a middle ground look like for this to end? And what would you do if you were Trump?
Well, let's first of all ask the question, the first question that you asked, what can be done about this? And the short answer is that we can do nothing. We are not the military hegemon. In other words, we are not so vastly superior in our military power that we can dominate Eastern Europe and Russia. Can't be done. That was my point earlier. Russia is a continental power, a land power. We are primarily a maritime and naval power. That's very important to understand. We don't have the staying power in the Eastern Hemisphere. It would be as if the Russians were heavily engaged in Mexico, building up forces there to attack us. That would be insane, because we would be the dominant force that they could not possibly resist. So in truth, what can we do? The only thing we can do is essentially what I think President Trump set out to do, which is tell Zelensky to shut up and color. And that's what he has to do. You know, you don't let a small power that is already in the middle of a hopelessly lost war that has cost 1.7 to 1.8 million Ukrainians in uniform, done irreparable damage to generations of Ukrainians. There are many people that don't think the Ukrainian nation will survive this. Now, that's the truth. And what President Trump has said, it's time to stop. We need to get the best possible outcome that we can get. Recognize what we cannot demand, recognize what we think we can get. There was no willingness on Zelensky's side to do that. So President Trump, I think, would like to wash his hands of the whole thing. I told him that I thought that was the best thing for him to do from the very beginning. Listen, I didn't start this. I don't support it. We're leaving. We're out. And the Europeans are full of nonsense. These people have nothing to offer. They don't have armies to send. And if they tried to, they'd all be obliterated.
Yeah, there's been reports earlier that the US is moving their military, a lot of their military installations away from Eastern Europe, at least military support from Eastern Europe. There were unconfirmed reports which showed, and then also there was the post in Truth Social by Trump where he said, Zelensky could regain all their territory back, maybe go further. Good luck to them with the support of support of NATO and support of the EU. So it looked like that he was washing his hands early on. Is that an indication that if Zelensky does not accept a deal now, there is a possibility that Trump does walk away? Because we also know he wants to achieve peace. He wants that achievement like he had in the Middle East.
Well, what does he have in the Middle East?
At least a ceasefire for now. I know there's a lot of
I don't
holes
think
in
so.
it.
I don't think so. I think the Israelis are doing exactly what the hell they want to do. I don't think they give a damn about any of the alleged agreements that were made. And I didn't see Hamas or Netanyahu show up in Sharm el-Sheikh. So I think that's a facade, if it's not just an illusion. That's a personal observation, take it or leave it. I just don't see that as being very meaningful. I don't think that he should sign up for another facade. All you do is damage your credibility. Our credibility is pretty low right now. Very few people in the world believe anything we say. So I think
he walks away.
Yeah, I think President Trump would like to disengage, which is the polite term. And the best way to disengage is to announce to your allies that you're on your own because we're not going to participate in this war with Russia. In other words, if you want to engage Russia directly in an offensive war, remember, we're not talking about a defensive war. We're talking about an offensive war. We're not with you. And that's completely legitimate. At the same time, Ukraine has lost.
But how much will they lose? If the US is not supporting Ukraine anymore, then Putin has an incentive to go beyond the Donbas. At least now there's some sort of deterrence with American support.
Yeah, but you had that map up there. And the only thing that is not currently in Russian hands on that map really is Odessa. That whole banana belt that you highlighted on that thing is the historic Novorossiya, New Russia, and has been Russified. The people that live there are overwhelmingly Russians. Odessa has always been a Russian city, was never part of Ukraine. Everybody says, well, who cares? Back in 1950, Khrushchev gave it to his party buddies after a drunken evening on the town, so now it is. And that's not true. You can say that, but it isn't. But if you look at the green areas to the top, and then you look at the green area at the bottom, I'm talking about, there. That area should reach over to Odessa, and I imagine the Russians will take Odessa. Now, I would be more concerned about that if I were Zelensky, because that turns your remaining Ukraine into a landlocked country. If I were in his position, I would not want that to happen. But what is to stop him from getting there? Nothing. He can get there whenever he wants to go. Does he want to go to Kiev? Not really, although he does revere Kiev as the cradle of Orthodox Christianity as a Russian, but he doesn't really want to fight for it. Does he want to go any further west? Not very much, because the further west you go, the more real Ukrainians you run into. These are not people that are Russified. These are not people of Russian culture and Russian language. He doesn't want to rule them. The problem for the Russians is they don't want Ukraine to be a platform for attack against Russia in the future. And that's been Lavrov's mantra repeatedly. Whatever happens in Ukraine, we don't want to refight this war. We don't want to go back down this road again. We want a new security architecture for Europe. And there's no willingness whatsoever on President Trump's part to discuss that. President Trump has always been very short-fused. Let's get a deal. What's the deal? Well, let's get a ceasefire. That's a deal. What good is a ceasefire if the ceasefire doesn't produce lasting peace? If the ceasefire produces more injustice to both parties? No one wants that. The Russians don't want it. We just want, hey, let's have a deal and we can all go home happy. And I can go back and say, see, I got a deal. And that's what Trump has done in the Middle East. Forget it. That deal isn't real. That's the problem. The war is not over in the Middle East. So the point is, why do we want this in Eastern Europe? We want an end to it, we would think, but we don't care.
Why is the Donbas so important? Why is that Putin's main focus? Because even though Ukraine only has 25% of Donetsk, that 25% includes the two major cities. And Ukraine makes the argument that this is heavily fortified over the years by NATO. So that makes it geographically a very important launching base for Russia if Russia wants to continue a war with Ukraine. So strategically, from a military perspective, that region seems very important. Is that the case? And is there any circumstances that, based on what you're saying, though, based on your argument that, America could be walking away, shouldn't Zelensky just accept the deal despite the strategic importance of Donetsk?
I think he should step forward if he cared about the Ukrainian people, which I don't think he does. I think this man is a puppet, and he's there to do whatever he's told by the wealthy and influential powers in the West. So I have, to me, Zelensky might as well be Epstein. I keep telling everybody we want to see the Epstein file. Let's see the Zelensky file. I'm sure it's just as bad. This is a terrible regime. Having said that, Ukraine needs peace, but it needs enduring peace. You're asking me questions regarding what the Russians will or will not accept. We don't even know if the substance of the discussion that you've outlined is true. We don't know. I haven't seen the text of the discussion, the 2.5-hour phone call between Putin and Trump. So I don't know what was really offered or considered. The other thing is that President Trump sometimes misinterprets, and he hears something that he likes and thinks he can latch onto, and then comes out and says, I got it. We can go with this. I don't know what was ultimately offered. The Russians signaled some flexibility. Because they signaled some flexibility, Donald Trump was willing to go back to Zelensky and say, look, your back is against the wall. You really have no chance of winning. You should accept this. The Europeans have all joined hands. When I say Europeans, that's wrong. I should say Macron, Starmer, Merz, and this man Rutte. That's really the cabal. Now, maybe Sikorsky in Poland and Tusk, sure, they're part of this little cabal. But it's wrong to say the Europeans, because I see no stomach in Europe anywhere for a war with Russia. And that's really what their governments are talking about. So I don't know all the details, but I think this was an attempt by President Putin to signal some flexibility to put an end to the war, because he'd like it to end too. He's not celebrating the death of 130,000 Russians over the last 3.5 years. He's not even celebrating the death of all those Ukrainians who are Orthodox Christians. He never wanted that. So he would like to see an end to this, but he has a duty and an obligation to Russia to ensure there will be no resumption of this war in the future, which means this neo-Nazi regime that sits in Kiev, that sends its troops out with Waffen-SS insignias on their uniforms, does not resurge in the future. In other words, it will go away. And instead, you'll get a neutral style state like Austria. Zelensky won't accept that because the Europeans tell him, don't do it. Okay, so if you're President Trump, what do you say? Fine, gentlemen, enjoy yourselves, but I have other fish to fry. And right now, it's very obvious that he's far more focused on Latin America.
You're in all our discussions, very, very, very critical of President Zelensky. Is there anything you respect or like in him?
No.
At all? Not his courage through this invasion early on?
Courage. Look, let's not even go there. Find somebody else to talk to if you want to talk about anything virtuous in the man. I see none. Never have. And I think at some point in the future, he will be exposed to scrutiny, and it will be very, very bad. But that's a matter for Ukrainians in the future.
It's mainly him being a puppet for the West at Ukraine's expense. Is that how you see it?
Well, you have to go back to Victoria Nuland. She worked closely with Kolomoisky, the oligarch. Kolomoisky picked up Zelensky, who was a Jew from Russia, and planted him in Ukraine as the new leader, and then saw to it that he was elected. Wrote his script for him. And his script when he ran for election, if you go back and examine it, was peace with Russia. You elect me, and I will talk to the Russians. I will go to Moscow. I will do what is required to end this conflict with the Russians, which is something the vast majority of Ukrainians wanted. They wanted an end to it. Now, we all know none of that happened, and he turned into a very different human being. But he turned into a human being that the globalists, everybody who's a member of the World Economic Forum, the leadership in Washington and the major capitals all wanted. Remember Boris Johnson, who shows up in April after there were discussions in Turkey, and there was a willingness to sign an agreement then and there, and suddenly it all died. Why? Because Boris Johnson came representing the interests of Washington and the major heads in Western Europe and said, stand your ground. We will support you. If you work with us, you will have the total backing of the NATO alliance. All the military power, technology, economic strength available will be behind you. You can't lose. So he did.
What about President Putin? Is there what would be your biggest critique of him? What has he done? Is it the invasion itself, despite NATO expansion, invading another country is a red line you stand against, or
well,
any other
absolutely.
reasons?
I opposed NATO expansion from the very beginning. I was on board with George Kennan, who warned against it in the 1990s. George Kennan is someone whose works I read when I was in graduate school, and I came to respect him enormously. And he was right about everything over the last 90 years of history. And unfortunately, nobody listened to him. But he warned against expansion, saying it would inevitably lead to a conflict with Russia. And Putin repeatedly, after he took over in 2000, in the last 25 years, has repeated that over and over and over again. Don't advance. Don't push it any further. He went into Georgia over South Ossetia because Georgia was meddling with with NATO. He wanted to make it clear then, don't come in here. Again, I go back to Cuba, go back to Mexico. What will we tolerate in those places? Nothing.
But we still wouldn't accept an invasion of a Latin American country for whatever reason, even if it happened, even though the US has invaded different countries for reasons we both disagree with. That justify?
We invaded Cuba 3 times in the 20th century. We wrote their constitution. We supervised their elections. How'd that turn out?
So do you think that the invasion of Ukraine was justified? I understand the NATO expansion playing a big role in it, but do you think invading a sovereign country rather than fighting that threat through other means? Because look, Sweden and Finland are part of NATO as well now.
He had tried. He had tried repeatedly. He came to Munich. He was represented at all the key conferences. His foreign minister, everyone tried repeatedly to say, do not try to incorporate Ukraine into NATO. You've already broken your promises to us. You've advanced the border of NATO to the edge of Poland. Now you want to go into Ukraine. We would not tolerate that in Georgia. We will not tolerate it in Ukraine. You just said something which is very telling. All the NATO defenses and fortifications that have been built in Ukraine. Why? Why are we there building anything?
You've got now the big base in Romania as well. I think
yeah, why? Why are we there?
In Europe.
I went to the Kennedy School shortly before I retired. I was asked to come up there and talk about military transformation. This is 2003. After it was over, there were 19 Russian generals in the audience. And they grabbed me and put me in a corner and said, please talk to us, answer some questions. I said, okay. And one of the things they want to know is, what are you doing in Romania with this missile base? This missile base is a threat to us. Well, I knew that the popular line at the time was that this was being built to protect Europe from Iranian missiles. Of course, nobody in Europe believed that. Nobody had asked for it. But that was the argument. Finally, I said, well, look, I don't think it's a threat to you, but here's something more. Well, they said, you brought Romania into NATO. And I said, are you telling me that the Russian army is afraid of the Romanian army? Of course, they all broke out laughing. The point is, we have pushed the Russians to the edge. This is what we used to refer to in the Cold War as brinksmanship. We've pushed and pushed and pushed. We knew when Putin went into Crimea why he went there, because he didn't want it to become a NATO naval base. And NATO was determined to make the Black Sea essentially a NATO lake dominated by us.
No, the last thing I want to ask you about is, why not end the war now for Putin? Putin has the upper hand in making a decision on when to stop the war. Why not end it now? Do you think there's people in his camp, more hardliners, that would go against him if he takes such a decision? Could that be unpopular in his home country with voters, considering the amount of destruction or death or destruction that Russia has faced? Obviously, Ukraine faced a lot more, but Russia still has thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, that's whatever number you want to believe. And the economy did take a hit.
I don't think the economy has struggled on the scale that we imagine in the West.
Definitely not. I agree, yeah.
They're doing very well. Their shelves are full. There's nobody starving in Russia. They have all the fuel they need. I think right now in Russia, and again, I'm not there, so I'm dependent upon my sources on the ground, basically in Poland, Ukraine, and Russia itself. to give me a snapshot of what general feelings are and what I would call unofficial polling data. But nevertheless, there are polls that are being taken. I think the Ukrainians are exhausted. They don't want to fight. They want this over with. I'm talking about the Ukrainian people. No one wants to join. No one wants to join an army that is being slaughtered day in and day out. Inside Russia, the attitude is, President Putin, we support you. We like you. You've been too soft. This has taken too long. You need to go in and crush them. That's the feeling.
So if he accepts to freeze the lines, that would backfire back home.
I don't think it would be well received, because the key question that would come up is that everyone would say, is the war over, or are we going to go through this again? A ceasefire line is a ceasefire line. It's not a peace agreement. It doesn't provide for future security. They want future security. They don't want to go back and refight the war. And that's President Putin's dilemma. He doesn't want to go any further. But if he sees that there is no alternative because no one will talk to him, then that's probably what he will do. I've always said that from the beginning. This man is a reluctant warrior, if ever there was one. But don't misread that as weakness.
How's his grip on power now? We have there's some people talking about the reports of some oligarchs dying or going missing.
Yeah, well, somebody was trying to tell me the other day that, China's about to erupt in civil war. And I've listened to lots of people talk about China's in imminent danger of falling apart and collapsing.
That's been the case. That's been the case for the last 20 years.
That's all nonsense. The Chinese have huge problems inside their country, but it doesn't necessarily translate into wishful thinking for us that they're going to fall apart. It just means they've got problems and they know it, particularly with corruption. And the Chinese are absolutely not warlike and don't want to war with anybody. They want to avoid it as much as possible. And that's another restraint on Putin, because he's consulted not only with Modi, but also with Xi and others in Asia. And they've all counseled him, exercise restraint, look for a negotiated end to this, work on the diplomatic level. And he's done that. That's why Putin has enormous support in the so-called global South, because he's seen as a reasonable man who wants to minimize bloodshed. We are viewed very differently, and I'm talking about the United States now, and France, and Great Britain, and unfortunately, increasingly, Germany. My point is that he's in no danger of being removed. No one is going to remove him. That's all nonsense.
He doesn't have cancer.
That's right. Yeah, he was supposed to have died right now, right? It was 2 or 3 years ago. Oh, but here's another one. They killed 6 people in order to replenish his liver. They removed livers from 6 people to keep him alive. It's all nonsense. It's sickening.
You just mentioned Modi before we end this. Do you give a win for Trump for convincing India to cut their oil imports from Russia by 50% by December, January? Could that change things for Russia?
I don't think so. I haven't seen that. Was that just announced within the last 20
No, that was reported. I don't know if it's been confirmed by Trump. I think it was reported a couple of weeks ago that India will gradually cut their oil imports from Russia by about 50% by December, January.
I'm unaware.
If that's the case, would that change much for Russia?
I don't think so. I mean, Russia has an endless market for its resources in China, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia. Certainly in the Middle East, they're doing a bang up business right now. I don't think it's significant, but I don't believe it, because when an official spokesman from India have been asked, they said, we made no such agreement. We made no such commitment. So see, he says, Donald Trump says, well,
yeah, exactly. I think there were reports. You're right. From memory, and I'll let the producer check, but I think from memory there was a report from India saying saying that deal isn't what Trump says it is. I can't remember what the exact statement was. But either way, you just said that even if that's the case, that wouldn't impact the Russian economy much.
There's an awful lot going on right now in the world, and I don't think that in 6 months things will look as they do now. I think the world will change. India has a long-term strategic relationship with Russia from the very beginning. I see no evidence that we are going to change that or alter that in any substantive way. And that's really what Trump has been all about. It's not going to
And
work.
you don't think the war on Gaza's ended?
No, I do not. I mean, I would be delighted if I could sit here and say so, but they're continuing to kill people in Gaza. They've killed, I think, between 50 and 100 here within the last few days. They're attacking in Lebanon. It looks to me as though they're preparing for the next great assault on Iran. And we have certainly committed lots of forces and critical munitions and so forth to use in the region. You see, that one of the things that I thought might happen as a result of the meeting in Budapest is that there would be some sort of arrangement that would effectively allow us to disengage from any further confrontation with the Russians in Eastern Europe, which is really President Trump's goal. Because disengaging from that would give us greater flexibility in the Middle East and in the Caribbean basin. But that hasn't happened. So we'll have to see. He may just unilaterally do what we discussed and say, I've gone as far as I can. Now we're getting out. We got 100,000 troops stretched from Lithuania down to Romania. What are they doing? Nothing.
100,000 troops.
Yeah. What are they doing? They're spread there. They're sitting in bases. They're sitting in tents. They're going out and training periodically, but there's no value in that. They have no mission. We're not going to invade Ukraine, and the Russians aren't going to invade Western Europe. It's not happening.
Yeah. And on the Gaza thing, Hamas said they don't want to disarm. They're pretty clear about it. And now you've got clashes with Hamas and groups that were allegedly funded by Israel, the Al-Shabaab group. So we've got clashes within Gaza. Doesn't look good.
You've talked to Max Blumenthal, and he knows the details on those things better than anybody I've run into. The Israelis are always asked the question, what are the core objectives for the Israelis? Have any of those been met? No, they haven't.
Yeah. Colonel, absolute pleasure as always. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mario. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.